Hello everyone, this is Mr. Combs, and today I want to talk about poetry and form. Traditionally, poems are written in stanzas. A stanza is any group of related lines forming a division in a poem. They are usually separated by blank space, but they do not have to be. According to Saphir and Daniel, stanzas are usually used to mark divisions of thought in a poem, and so they function uh, something as paragraphs do in prose. Stanzas are usually named by the number of lines they contain. So a stanza with 2 lines is called a couplet. A tercet is a stanza with 3 lines. A quatrain is a stanza containing 4 lines. And according to Kennedy and Gioia, quatrains are used in rhymed poems more often than any other form. A quintet has 5 lines, a sestet 6, and a septet has 7 lines. And an octave has 8. Certain comma stanza forms have been given specific names over the years. So, for example, there is a stanza called a heroic couplet. And a heroic couplet is 2 lines of rhymed iambic pentameter. The first line ending in a light break, and the second one in a more dramatic and final pause. There is also a triplet. And a triplet is a special kind of tercet where all 3 lines have the same rhyme. So let's consider the following poem by Robert Herrick. Upon Julia's Close. When as in silks my Julia goes, then methinks how sweetly flows that liquefaction of her clothes. Next when I cast mine eyes and see that brave vibration each way free, oh, how that glittering taketh me. So notice in each of these stanzas, we have the same rhyming sound throughout. Goes, flows, close, see, free, me. So this poem is made up of 2 triplets. Remember that a triplet is a stanza where all 3 lines rhyme. One note that I have here is that when reading a poem aloud, it is tempting to use the ends of lines as pauses in the reading. And in fact, it's very hard not to do this. However, this may make a poem seem stilted and dull. You should really try to read a poem based on the punctuation rather than a stanza arrangement. An end-stop line is one that ends with a pause. So, for example, in Herrick's poem, lines 3, 5, and 6 are end-stop lines. So in line 3, it says that liquefaction of her clothes, period, right? So really, I should have read this, when as in silks my Julia goes, then methinks how sweetly flows that liquefaction of her clothes, and then I can pause. And 5 and 6 also have a pause at the end of the line. That brave vibration each way free, there's a semicolon there, so I should pause for a brief moment. Oh, how that glittering taketh me, and then that ends in an exclamation, excuse me. So the opposite of an end stop line, or a line that spills over onto the next, or when a sentence in a poem spills from one line over to the other, that is called an enjambment. And it's the running of one line into the next without a grammatical pause. For instance, lines 1 and 2 contain enjambment, as do lines 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 of Herrick's poem. When reading this poem aloud, the reader should not pause between the words goes and then, as I said before, even though there is a line break. And then finally, a pause that occurs in the middle of a line of poetry is called a caesura. So let's consider Alexander Pope's line, to err is human, to forgive divine. So we have that pause right in the middle of the line after human. To err is human, to forgive, divine. So that is called a caesura. As mentioned at the beginning of our study of literature, poetry can be categorized as narrative, dramatic, or lyric. Let's talk about narrative poetry first. Narrative poetry tells a story, and Kennedy and Gioia state that the art of narrative poetry invites the skills of a writer of fiction, the ability to draw characters and settings, to engage attention, to shape a plot, and needless to say, it calls for all the skills of a poet as well. So narrative poetry sort of marries the idea of fiction and poetry. Um, the writer of a narrative poem needs to be able to make believable characters, have an interesting plot, but they also need to manipulate sound and use imagery and figurative language just like a poet. One type of narrative poem is the epic. An epic is usually a long poem relating to the adventures of an epic hero. An epic is serious in tone and often highlights the characteristics and qualities a society admires. Saphir and Daniel state, most epics are lofty poems concerned with heroes and heroines who are larger than life, and the poem itself is told in a stately and dignified language. Examples of epic poems include Gilgamesh, the Iliad, the Odyssey, Beowulf, the Mahabharata, Milton's Paradise Lost, and Omeros by Derek Walcott is a modern epic poem. Another type of narrative poem is the ballad. And a ballad is a relatively short poem relating to a single dramatic event originally meant to be sung. Ballads are usually tragic in mood, and they make use of dialogue, repetition, and refrain. Typical subjects for the ballad include love and the loss of love, murder, treachery, supernatural encounters, and domestic quarrels. According to Pickering and Hopper, ballads tend to be objective, abrupt, and concise. A folk or traditional ballad is an anonymous one arising from common people and passed down through generations as part of an oral tradition. These were popular in Europe in the Middle Ages, but they have also been an important tradition in the Appalachian region in the United States even today. Since they were originally passed down through word of mouth, there are often many versions of the same story among folk ballads. Consider, for example, this song. So this is the ballad of Tom Dooley, and you may have heard this before. I'm sure you have. Um, well, almost sure that everyone has probably heard it, but I'm not going to try to sing it. But it goes, hang down your head, Tom Dooley, hang down your head and cry, hang down your head, Tom Dooley, poor boy, you're bound to die. I met her on the mountain, there I took her life, I met her on the mountain, stabbed her with my knife. And then another verse, this time tomorrow, reckon where I'll be, hadn't a been for Grayson, I'd be in Tennessee. This time tomorrow, reckon where I'll be, down in some lonesome valley, hanging from a white oak tree. So notice the subject matter here. It's murder, right? Murder and the consequences, right? So many ballads, such as Tom Dooley, make use of a quatrain with a general rhyme scheme, of A, B, C, B. And this has become known as a ballad stanza. So we're going to read a ballad as one of our poems for this week, but this ballad will be a literary ballad. It is one written by a known author. So the only difference between a folk ballad or a traditional ballad and a literary ballad is the literary ballad is written by a known author. According to Saphir and Daniel, literary ballads sometimes try to imitate the style of folk ballads, but in general they tend to be more elaborate, both in language and form. Poe's poem Annabel Lee is an example of a literary ballad, right? It tells a story. It has the subject matter of death, The Loss of Love, right? So that's a literary ballad, and we're also going to be reading a literary ballad um, this week as well. Another type of poetry is dramatic poetry. And dramatic poetry presents the voice of a character speaking directly without additional narration or explanation from the poet. So when you have a dramatic poem, you have a character, a persona who is speaking. Um, Saphir and Daniel state a dramatic poem has many of the characteristics of a play, right? There is a definite setting, a dramatic situation, emotional conflict, vigorous speech, and natural language rhythms. In fact, many dramatic poems are passages from plays written in verse. Shakespeare's plays, for example, are full of what we would call dramatic poetry. The most common form of dramatic poetry is the dramatic monologue, or a poem in which a character speaks to one or more other characters whose responses are not given in the poem. So, dramatic poetry involves a character speaking. You may, in fact, have another character speaking um, back to the first character. So dramatic poetry is just poetry that involves characters speaking directly without narration from a poet. But a dramatic monologue is a particular type of dramatic poem in which the speaker speaks and we do not hear the replies or the comments of the character who the speaker is speaking to. The speaker of a dramatic monologue is usually in a moment of personal crisis and reveals his or her deepest, darkest secrets. If you remember the poem from our first week studying poetry, To His Coy Mistress by Andrew Marvell, that is an example of a dramatic monologue. Saphir and Daniel suggest reading a dramatic monologue is like listening to one end of a telephone conversation. From what is said at your end, you must imagine what is said on the other end. And I think that's a really good comparison. Even though speakers of dramatic monologues may tell a story, Pickering and Hopper distinguish it from narrative poetry. For them, because a monologue is basically reflective, the structure rarely follows that of a conventional story. It is likely to be digressive, argumentative, and analytic, rather than strictly narrative.